People ask me what it sounded like. I tell them it didn't sound like anything exactly. It was more like a feeling that moved through your chest and came out the other side, the way a deep bell resonates in your sternum before your ears have even registered the tone. They nod and write things down, and I can see on their faces that they haven't understood, and I don't blame them. I was there, and I barely understand it myself. My name is Petra Vane. I was 53 years old when it happened. I am not a scholar. I am not an archaeologist, a xenolinguist, a xenobiologist, or a diplomat. I am not a member of any of the 17 academic delegations that spent the better part of 3 decades trying to open the vault at Karath-Ul. I was a digger. I worked a shovel and a pry bar and a slotted brush, and my job was to move spoil, the loose rock and compacted grit that accumulated at the base of the vault's outer face, so that the scholars and instrument operators had clean ground to work on. I kept the site tidy. That was my job. I did it for 11 years on a world I had never intended to stay on, and on the morning it happened I was running 30 minutes late, because the weld on my left boot had come apart overnight, and I had spent most of the pre-dawn hour pressing it back together with a contact iron that needed a new element. I want to be precise about these things, because I have found in the years since that the people who write about the Karath-Ul event tend to turn it into something grander in the setup than it was. They describe the site in almost religious terms, the vault gleaming and imposing, the diggers awed and reverent even in their daily routine. The truth is that after 11 years, the vault was just the vault. It was a large flat face of black veined stone set into a basalt shelf that jutted from the plateau's north wall, and it was approximately 20 meters wide and 14 meters tall, and it had no visible seam, no hinged line, no mechanism of any kind that anyone had been able to identify in 30 years of analysis. It was fused into the bedrock as if it had grown there, or as if the rock had grown around it. The geologists had argued about this for decades. The stone it was made of was not the stone of the surrounding plateau. The molecular analysis placed it as something close to a metamorphic quartzite, but the pressure signatures embedded in its crystalline structure were inconsistent with any natural formation process known to science. The closest working theory when I was there was that the material had been manufactured, compressed, and crystallized under conditions that didn't occur naturally, and then seeded into the bedrock through a process no one had yet identified. It was also, in the way that only very old things can be, beautiful. The black veins that ran through the lighter matrix of the stone had a quality in certain light, the low, raking morning light especially, that made them look less like mineral inclusions and more like something written, not in any script anyone recognized. Just the suggestion of writing, the rhythm of it, the sense that the pattern was not random. I noticed this on my first morning at the site, 11 years before the event. I stopped noticing it around year 3, the way you stop noticing the particular way your kitchen window frames a mountain. It becomes furniture. The vault became furniture. That is the truth. The history of Karath-Ul is longer than I am qualified to recount in full, but the short version is this. The site was discovered 31 years before I arrived, during the initial survey of the plateau for a proposed mining operation. The survey crew reported the vault to the colonial authority within 48 hours of first sighting. The mining operation was suspended indefinitely, and within 8 months, the first academic expedition had established a base camp at the plateau's edge. That expedition lasted 3 years and produced a great deal of data and no result. The vault did not open, did not respond to any instrument stimulus, did not respond to any acoustic signal, did not respond to chemical application, did not respond to thermal variation, and this was considered significant, did not respond to the touch of any of the 27 expedition members who were permitted to make direct physical contact under controlled conditions. The rule about physical contact had been strict from the beginning, but it evolved over time. In the early years, No direct contact of any kind was permitted for preservation reasons, standard protocol for an unclassified xenogenic structure. By the time I arrived at the site, the rule had been revised to allow authorized personnel to touch the vault's surface with gloved hands during instrument-assisted surveys, and a small number of specially cleared researchers had been permitted to make brief bare-skin contact during dedicated contact experiments, each one logged, each one resulting in no response. The vault was indifferent. That was the consensus. It was not dormant, not sleeping, not waiting. It was simply inert, a sealed door with no lock and no mechanism, and nothing on the other side that any instrument array could detect, though the imaging data was inconclusive enough that this point was regularly disputed. By the time I was there, the site had been surveyed by 11 separate expeditions, 5 of them under the flag of the Conclave of Settled Worlds, 2 under direct colonial authority mandate, and 4 funded by private academic consortiums. 3 heads of government had visited, 2 of them with full diplomatic ceremonials, the kind that involved banners and speeches, and the physical laying of hands on the vault's surface by the dignitary in question, which by that point had been cleared as a permissible gesture. Nothing happened during these ceremonies. The vault was unmoved. The dignitaries were photographed with their palms flat against the stone, and the photographs were used in political communications back home, and the vault did not care. I want to be clear that I am not saying this to diminish anyone. 30 years of rigorous work had been done at that site by people far more educated than me, and they had extracted a great deal of genuine scientific understanding about the vault's material composition, its age, which the most current dating methods placed it somewhere between 40,000 and 90,000 years, with the range of uncertainty, a source of ongoing professional disagreement, and its structural relationship to the bedrock. None of that work was wasted. But the vault did not open for any of them, and I want to be honest about how ordinary and unremarkable it had become in the daily life of a person who worked there. It was the thing at the end of the path. You walked past it to get to the eastern spoil pile. On windy days, the dusted shed had a particular smell, mineral and faintly sweet, like something between chalk and old copper. That smell was just part of the air at Karath-Ul after a while. There had been, across those 30 years, one incident that the site historians noted with more than passing interest. During the 7th Karath-Ul survey, 11 years before my arrival, a researcher named Dov Kassel had been working alone at the vault face during an instrument downtime, conducting what he later described as an informal observation. Sitting with the vault, he said, not doing anything specifically, just being present with it. He had removed his gloves during this time, and his hands had been in contact with the vault's outer apron, the stone shelf at the base, not the vault face itself, for approximately 30 minutes. He reported a slight warmth in the stone, slightly above ambient. He reported what he described as a sense of attentiveness, as if something was aware of him. This report was filed, reviewed, and classified as subjective and unverifiable. The instruments had recorded nothing during that period. Kassel's account was included in the 7th survey's supplementary observations, with a note that its evidentiary value was low. He left the site at the end of that survey's term, and as far as I know, never returned. I did not know this story when I arrived at Karath-Ul. I learned it 3 years after the event, when a researcher who had been reviewing the historical survey records flagged it for comparison with my incident report. I thought about Kassel sometimes after that, about what he had felt and whether it was related to what I felt, about whether he had simply been close but not the right thing, and the vault had felt that too and registered it somehow, a proximity, a partial resonance, without being able to open. I do not know. No one does. He died on Karath Station 7 years before my incident, and the question will remain open. I came to the site because I needed work, and the colonial authority was hiring maintenance labor for what they call the Karath-Ul extended survey phase. The pay was reliable, the housing was provided, and I had just come off a difficult 2 years on Marin's Reach that I do not need to go into here except to say that I needed somewhere quiet and somewhere regular, and a dig site on a basalt plateau with a sealed vault that didn't do anything seemed like both. I am a practical person. I have never been particularly interested in mysteries for their own sake. The vault was a mystery, yes, but the spoil pile needed clearing, and the survey grid needed sweeping, and the work was the work. I was good at it. I am not saying that to boast. It is just a fact that 11 years of the same tasks on the same site makes you good at them. The way water cutting the same channel eventually knows exactly where to go. I knew the spoil distribution patterns. I knew which sections of the outer face accumulated grit fastest and needed the most frequent clearing. I knew the surface of the vault's lower third better than most of the researchers knew their own data sets, because I had brushed it clean with a slotted tool approximately 2,000 times, and you develop an intimate familiarity with something you have touched that many times, even through gloves. This matters. I want you to understand this before we get to the morning itself. The vault was not a stranger to me, not a mystery I was approaching for the first time. It was the thing I had worked beside for 11 years, and if there was any reverence in me for it, it was the reverence you develop for something very old and very patient, the way a farmer might have reverence for a hillside that has been farmed for 100 generations. Not awe, exactly. Something more like respect. And familiarity. The morning of the event was the first morning of the new survey cycle's maintenance week. The current expedition team, the 14th Karath-Ul survey, a joint academic colonial authority project with a complement of 38 researchers and 12 support staff, had completed its primary instrument sweep the day before, and the equipment was being reconfigured for the second phase. This meant a quieter period at the vault face, with no active arrays operating, while the instrument leads ran calibrations in the base camp lab. The survey team had an early briefing that morning, and most of the researchers were either at the lab or at breakfast. I was the only person assigned to vault face work on that shift. My task was to clear the lower apron, the roughly 2-meter band of compacted grit at the base of the vault, and to brush the lower third of the face for the instrument team's afternoon work. I arrived at the face at 7:30, which was 30 minutes later than my usual start, because of the boot issue I mentioned. The morning light was coming in from the east at a low angle across the plateau, the kind of light that made the black veins in the stone look alive, and I remember noticing that and thinking that I would never entirely stop noticing it, even after 11 years, even with the vault being furniture. I set my kit down. I pulled on my work gloves, standard issue excavation gloves, thick polymer mid-forearm length, and I started at the left edge of the lower apron and worked my way right, which was my habit. It took me about 40 minutes to clear the apron to my satisfaction. The grit was lighter than usual. The previous day had been calm with little wind, so there was less accumulation than on a typical morning. I moved to the brush work. I was starting at the lower left corner of the face, working the slotted brush in the short horizontal strokes that dislodge surface particles without scratching the stone, and I was about 4 meters along the base when my left glove caught on something. This had happened before. The lower left quadrant of the face had an area of slightly raised surface, a cluster of the black veins that ran a few millimeters proud of the surrounding matrix, and over the years the edge of this cluster had caught my glove more than once. Usually I just tugged free and kept working. This time, the snag was sharper than usual. I don't know if the surface had fractured slightly, or if the angle was different, and when I tugged, the glove tore. Not the whole glove, just the fingertip region of the index and middle fingers, a clean split along the seam where the polymer met the reinforced tip. Not a large tear, maybe 2 centimeters. I looked at it for a moment. I was 4 meters into a sweep I needed to finish before the afternoon team arrived. The base camp was a 6-minute walk. I had a spare pair of gloves in my kit bag, which was at the left edge of the face, 8 meters behind me. I decided to finish the current meter before going back for the spare gloves. I was already crouched, already positioned, and I told myself I would be careful. I was careful. I worked the brush with the torn hand held slightly awkward, keeping the exposed fingertips from the stone. I finished that meter. I moved to the next. I was reaching forward with the brush, my left arm extended along the face, when the plateau shuddered, a brief faint tremor, nothing alarming. The plateau had minor seismic events from time to time, and I knew them well, and my balance shifted, and I put my left hand flat against the vault face to steady myself. The skin of my index and middle fingers, through the tear in the glove, was in contact with the stone. I felt the stone change under my hand. That is the only way I know to describe it. It didn't move. It didn't get warmer, or rather, it may have gotten warmer, but the change was so immediate and so total that I was already past registering it as temperature by the time my brain had caught up. What I felt was more like the stone deciding, not coming to life, because that implies it had been dead, and I don't think it had been dead. I think it had been waiting, and what I felt was the precise moment it stopped waiting. My palm was still flat against the face. I had not pulled away. I don't know why I didn't pull away. The professional protocol was clear. Any unexpected physical response from the vault face, personnel were to withdraw to the safe perimeter at 50 meters and contact base camp immediately. I knew that protocol. I had attended the safety briefings every year, but I did not pull away. I am not sure I could have. Not because I was frozen. I wasn't. I was very calm, which surprised me later, but because something in me understood, in a way that bypassed language and protocol and training entirely, that pulling away was simply not what was happening here. What was happening here was that I was being looked at. That is the only word I have. I was being looked at, not scanned, not assessed, not evaluated in any clinical sense. Looked at. The way a very old person looks at you sometimes, someone who has seen enough of the world to have a different quality of attention, a look that takes in not just your face but something further back. Your history, your nature, your particular arrangement of all the things that made you. That is what it felt like. I was being looked at by something that had been waiting long enough that waiting had become its natural condition, and it was looking at me now because I was the thing it had been waiting for, and it was simply taking a moment to be certain. The veins in the stone began to illuminate. Not from the outside, not like a lamp lighting up. From the inside, the way a coal illuminates when you blow on it, light building through the material itself, finding the channels the veins provided, traveling outward from the point where my fingers were in contact with the surface. The light was the color of something between deep amber and pale gold, and it moved steadily, unhurried, filling the veins of the lower third first, then the middle, then the upper reaches of the vault, the pattern spreading the way frost spreads across glass on a cold morning, following paths that were already there. I stayed where I was. I was crouched at the base of the vault, left hand still flat against the stone, right hand still holding the brush, which I had apparently not dropped. I was aware that my heart was beating very hard and very steadily. I was aware of my breathing. I was not afraid. I want to be honest about this. I was not afraid. I was moved in a way I had not been moved in a long time, and the feeling was so unfamiliar that for a moment I confused it with fear. But when I examined it, it was not fear. It was something closer to recognition. Like hearing a piece of music you forgot you knew, except the music was everywhere and it was about you specifically, and it had been waiting a very long time to be heard. The light continued to fill the vault face. By this point it was bright enough that I was casting a shadow, my crouched form outlined sharp against the basalt shelf behind me. I was aware of the base camp instruments, all of them, every sensor array, every passive detector coming online simultaneously. I could not see them from where I was, but I heard the distant change in ambient sound, the soft electronic chorus of 38 research stations waking all at once, and I knew what it was. The researchers would be looking at their screens, not believing what they were reading, reaching for their comm units. I didn't move, I didn't call out, I kept my hand on the stone. I was aware during this time of the quality of the light changing as it filled the vault face. It did not simply brighten uniformly. It had a rhythm to it, a pulse that was very slow, slower than a heartbeat, more like the rhythm of breathing, the long, slow breathing of something very large or very old. Each pulse was slightly warmer than the one before, the amber deepening toward gold, and with each pulse I felt the looking sensation intensify, the sense of being examined with increasing certainty. The way a face gradually resolves from ambiguity into recognition when seen across a distance. I had the feeling, which I cannot verify, and which I am not asking anyone to accept as anything more than subjective experience, that what was looking at me was learning something. Not learning who I was in any biographical sense, learning what I was, confirming it, confirming the thing it had been built to recognize, cross-referencing the fact of me against whatever record it held, working through the verification with the same careful, unhurried thoroughness that characterized everything it did. There was a sound then, or there was something that was not quite sound. It is the hardest thing to describe, and I have tried many times in many different contexts, and I have not yet found language that fully carries it. The best I have managed is this. Imagine a frequency below the range of hearing, the sort of thing you feel in large enclosed spaces in the chest and the jaw, but instead of being unpleasant or alarming, it carries the quality of a voice. Not words yet, just the quality. The sense of intention in it, the purposefulness of a voice before the voice has shaped itself into language. The stone under my palm shifted, not in the direction I would have expected, not inward, not along some sliding mechanism. It seemed to go still in a different way, the way water goes still when it turns to ice, a fundamental change in its state rather than a movement of position. And then at the center of the vault face, directly in front of me, a vertical line appeared. Clean, perfect, absolutely straight, running from the top of the vault to the bottom, 14 meters of clean separation where a moment before there had been nothing but solid stone. The vault opened. It opened slowly, the two halves drawing back from the center line the way a great pair of curtains might part, except that there were no curtains. There was only the stone, withdrawing into itself along some mechanism that the research teams would spend the next several years trying to fully understand. The gap that opened between the two halves grew from a sliver to a hand's width to a half meter to a full meter, and the light that came from within was different from the light of the illuminated veins, cooler, more even, the kind of light that seems to have no source because it is everywhere at once, the way good outdoor light on an overcast day has no shadow because the sky itself is the light. I stood up. I don't remember deciding to stand up, but I was standing. My left hand had come away from the stone as the vault opened, and I was standing at the center of the lower apron with both hands at my sides, looking into the open vault. The interior was larger than the exterior dimensions suggested it should be. This sounds impossible, and I know it sounds impossible. The researchers confirmed it later with measurement, and there are several competing theoretical frameworks being advanced to explain how the internal volume differs from what the external geometry would allow, and I am not qualified to evaluate any of them. What I can tell you is what I saw. A chamber, maybe 30 meters deep, perfectly circular in cross-section. The walls the same black-veined stone as the exterior face, but polished to something close to a mirror finish. The floor was flat and clear. In the center of the chamber there was a structure. I do not have a better word than structure. That was approximately 3 meters tall and shaped roughly like a column, except that it was not a uniform cylinder, but had a quality of having been grown or accreted. The way a stalactite builds itself over centuries from material that falls in exactly the same place. The column was not stone. I could see that from the entrance. It had the visual character of something very dense and very old, the same deep black as the veins in the outer wall, but with a surface that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. And at its core, there was a quality of depth that made it look less like an object and more like a window into something very dark and very far away. The voice came from there. Not from a speaker, not from a console or a panel or any visible mechanism. From the column itself, the way resonance comes from the body of a cello rather than from the bow. It came as that sub-frequency feeling first, the one I had felt before the door opened, but now it resolved into shape, into structure, into something my brain registered as language even before I could parse the individual words. 4 words, that is all it said. 4 words in something that was not exactly any language I had ever heard, and yet which I understood completely, the way you understand something you have known for so long that you have forgotten learning it. The understanding was not in my ears. It was in somewhere further back than that. In the place where the deepest things live, the things that do not change across the length of a life, the things that were there before you were old enough to name them. Oldest carbon, first flame. That was what it said. 4 words, and then nothing, and then a silence that was different from all the silences before it. A silence that was not the absence of sound, but the presence of something that had finished speaking and was now simply waiting to see if I had understood. I had understood. I stood at the entrance to the vault for a long time. I do not know how long. The base camp instruments were all reading, somewhere behind me, and the researchers were coming. I could hear distant footsteps, voices, the metallic percussion of someone moving quickly over the corrugated walkway from the lab, but I was not thinking about any of that. I was thinking about carbon, about what carbon is. I am not a scientist, but you cannot spend 11 years adjacent to the world's most intense concentration of xenobiological researchers without absorbing certain things, the way you absorb the vocabulary of any trade through proximity. And one of the things I had absorbed, over 11 years of eating lunch with researchers and overhearing presentations, and asking the occasional question during the quieter moments of a dig day, was a particular understanding of what carbon means. Not as a chemical, or not only as a chemical, as a history. Carbon is the element that life built itself from. It is the atom at the center of every biological molecule that has ever replicated itself, in every ocean on every world where life has managed to take hold. It is not the oldest element. Hydrogen is older. Helium is older. They came from the first moments of everything, and carbon came later, forged inside stars that had to live and die before the universe could have the carbon it needed. But of the elements that life uses, carbon is the one with the deepest and widest distribution. It is, the researchers would sometimes say, the element that the universe chose. Not by design, they would be careful to say that, the careful ones, but by fitness. Carbon bonds with more things in more configurations, under more conditions than anything else available. It is the foundation. And the oldest carbon, the carbon that was forged in the first generation of stars, that was scattered when those stars died, that was incorporated into the earliest planetary bodies, that became part of the first organic molecules that led, over an almost unimaginable span of time and accident and pressure and chemistry, to the first life. That oldest carbon is still here. It didn't go anywhere. It didn't decay or transform into something else. It got incorporated, passed forward. Every living thing on every world carries some of it, in among all the newer carbon, in among all the atoms that were forged later. The oldest carbon is distributed through the living world the way the oldest ideas are distributed through a culture. Quietly, without fanfare, present in everything and rarely identified specifically. First flame. I thought about that too, standing at the entrance while the footsteps got closer. I thought about what the researchers sometimes called the ignition events, the moments in the development of a solar system when the conditions for life first become possible, when the chemistry tips over into self-replication for the first time, the first living molecule that was not quite alive by any standard definition, and yet was doing the thing that life does, making more of itself from the materials available. The moment the flame caught. The researchers argued about where those ignition events had happened first, which worlds, which systems, how long ago. The numbers were staggering and contested, and I had always half-listened to those arguments at lunch with one ear, the way you listen to the weather forecast when you already know you'll be working outside regardless. First flame. I thought about that too, standing at the entrance while the footsteps got closer. I thought about what the researchers sometimes called the ignition events, the moments in the development of a solar system when the conditions for life first become possible, when the chemistry tips over into self-replication for the first time, the first living molecule that was not quite alive by any standard definition, and yet was doing the thing that life does, making more of itself from the materials available. The moment the flame caught. The researchers argued about where those ignition events had happened first, which worlds, which systems, how long ago. The numbers were staggering and contested, and I had always half-listened to those arguments at lunch with one ear, the way you listen to the weather forecast when you already know you'll be working outside regardless. I thought about a conversation I had had, maybe 5 years into my time at Karath-Ul, with a young xenobiologist named Karath who had just arrived for his first survey term, and who was still at the stage of talking about the vault with the enthusiasm of someone who had not yet been humbled by years of no result. He had been explaining, at lunch, the concept of molecular ancestry, the idea that if you could trace any given carbon atom backward through every organism it had ever been incorporated into, through every death and every decomposition and every recombination, you could in principle reach the first organism that had ever incorporated it. I had said that seemed like an impossible thing to actually do. He had agreed it was impossible in practice, but said the chain was real regardless of whether you could trace it. He had said, "The carbon doesn't know it's old. It just is what it is. But the record exists. Every transfer, every incorporation, every moment of life that used it and passed it on, that record exists even if nothing can read it." I had nodded and eaten my lunch and thought about other things, but standing at the entrance to the vault that morning, I thought about what Karath had said and understood it differently. The record existed, and something long ago had built a device that could read it. But standing there, I understood something that I could not have told you before that morning and cannot fully tell you now. I understood that the vault had been built to remember something, not to guard a treasure or secure a weapon or protect a bloodline in any political sense. To remember, the way a monument remembers, except that this monument's memory was encoded in something more fundamental than stone or inscription. It was encoded in the recognition of the thing itself, the biological fact that certain living things carry in their cells the specific molecular signature of the very oldest carbon, the first-generation stellar material that preceded every world that ever bore life, and that this signature, this deepest biological fact, is a form of inheritance that no empire or dynasty or institution can grant or revoke. It is not a title. It is not a position. It is what you are at the level of the atom. Something, a very long time ago, had built a vault to remember that, and had built into the vault the capacity to recognize it when it walked up and pressed a torn glove against the stone. I do not know who built it. No one does yet. The researchers have spent the years since my incident working inside the vault, which I should say has remained open, and has caused no harm to anyone who has entered it, and has offered no threat or instruction or demand of any kind, trying to understand what civilization built it and when and why. The working theory involves the existence of a spacefaring civilization that preceded all currently known contact terra civilizations by somewhere between 30 and 60,000 years. A civilization that was itself working from an understanding of biological history, so deep and so precise that they could identify the molecular signature of first-generation stellar carbon in living tissue, and that apparently cared enough about the fact of that signature to build this vault, on this world, in this rock, to mark the moment when a bearer of that signature came home. Came home. That is how one of the senior researchers described it to me, about 6 months after the event, when she was explaining what they had begun to understand about the vault's interior and the data encoded in the column. She said, "It is a homecoming marker. The civilization that built this was seeding life across the star systems. The researchers believe deliberately, though the evidence is still being assembled, and they built these markers at the origin points, the places where the oldest carbon first became life. They built them to recognize the descendants of that first life when they found their way back, however many thousands of years later, carrying the molecular signature of the beginning in the cells of their hands." I said, "Why a digger?" She looked at me for a moment and then she smiled, the kind of smile that meant she had been thinking about this too, and she said, "Why not a digger? The oldest carbon doesn't care what your title is. It was in the first molecule that ever replicated itself on a world where the conditions were right, and it has been passing itself forward ever since through every living thing, and it doesn't accumulate in the powerful or the educated or the credentialed any more than it accumulates in anyone else. You happen to be the one who pressed their skin against the stone. That's all." "That's all. I have thought about that for a long time." The researchers who came running that morning found me still at the entrance to the vault, standing on the apron, my torn glove on my left hand, my brush still in my right. I had not moved. Dr. Eshani Kaur arrived first. She was one of the instrument team leads. She had been in the lab running calibrations when every sensor she had woke up simultaneously, and she came around the shelf at a run and stopped dead at the sight of the open vault, the light coming from within, the column visible in the chamber's center. She stood there for about 5 seconds, which I know because I counted, and then she looked at me. I remember her face. I remember the specific quality of the expression on it, the way it moved through disbelief and shock and something else, something that was not quite either of those things, something that sat at the edge of wonder and landed somewhere closer to grief. Not a sorrowful grief, but the kind of grief you feel when you understand that something has been true for a very long time and you are only now learning it. She was the one who, 8 months later, gave the theory its working name, the origination vault. I think the name came from that moment, from her face on that morning. She said, "What did it say?" I said 4 words. I told her the 4 words. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "And you understood them?" I said yes. She asked me how I knew I had understood them and not simply felt like I had understood them, and I said I supposed I didn't know the difference, and I was fairly sure that was the point. She nodded. She was already recording on her personal unit. I could see her hand moving. She asked if I was all right. I said I was. I said I felt very calm. She said that was interesting and wrote something down, and I did not feel patronized by that because it was interesting. I was interested in it myself. The rest of the morning was the kind of controlled chaos that I imagine follows any significant scientific event, except that it was also happening in the middle of a very remote dig site on a world that most of the settled worlds considered a backwater, and the communications delay to the nearest major hub was 11 hours. So the researchers at Karath-Ul had 11 hours of working inside the vault before the news of what had happened reached anyone with the authority to complicate matters. I am grateful for those 11 hours. I am told the research that was done in that window, the initial interior survey, the first contact with the data encoded in the column, the preliminary material analysis of the chamber walls, is some of the most careful and methodical work of the 14th survey's record, which is remarkable given the circumstances. Researchers who have spent years working toward a result, and who are then suddenly given that result without warning, do not always respond with methodical care. This team did. I was there for some of it. I watched them work. There was something very quiet about it, very serious. Not the excitement you might expect, something more like reverence. The vault had waited so long. They were treating the interior with appropriate gravity. There was one moment, about 2 hours into the work, that I want to record here because I do not think it appears in any of the official documentation. I was sitting on the apron, tea long finished, watching the researchers move in and out of the vault entrance. Dr. Kaur came out for the third or fourth time to update her tablet's data log, and she paused beside me for a moment and looked at the plateau and the low morning sky and the basalt walls. There was no particular expression on her face. Just looking. Then she said quietly to no one specifically, 30 years, and then she went back inside. I understood what she meant. The vault had waited 40,000 years, or 90,000, or somewhere in between, and the researchers had been waiting 30, and 30 years of waiting is nothing compared to 90,000, and yet it is still 30 years of someone's working life, of waking up and coming to the plateau and doing the work and having the vault give nothing back. And when the thing you have been working toward finally happens, the feeling is not simply triumph. It is something more complicated, something that involves grief for all the people who worked here and left before it happened, and relief, and a strangeness at the suddenness of it after so long. I was examined by the site medical officer, a man named Tomas Reth who had been treating diggers' back injuries and minor equipment-related cuts for 3 years, and who handled the situation with a steady professionalism I am still grateful for. He checked my vital signs, which were normal. He looked at the torn glove and the skin of my index and middle fingers, which showed no mark, no burn, no reaction of any observable kind. He asked me a series of questions about my mental state, which I answered honestly. He entered everything in the medical log. He gave me a cup of tea from his kit and told me to sit down if I felt like sitting down. I sat down on the edge of the lower apron, with the open vault behind me and the morning light still coming in low from the east, and I drank the tea, and I thought. What I thought about was a morning on Marin's Reach, about 3 years before I came to Karath-Ul. I was working a salvage survey there, one of the interim jobs I took between the dig site contracts that were my real work, and I was walking a stretch of coastal plateau looking for surface indicators of a buried industrial site from the colony's early days. The work was dull and the morning was gray, and I was thinking about nothing in particular, just putting one foot in front of the other across the flat gray stone, when I crouched down for no specific reason, instinct maybe, or just the feeling that something was different about the stone at my feet, and found a fossil. Not an unusual thing to find on a world with a deep enough geological record, but this one was clear, a spiral form in the stone, a shell of some kind, from something that had lived in a sea on this world before the sea retreated, maybe 100,000 years ago, maybe more. I crouched there for a long time looking at it. Not because it was scientifically significant. I had no reason to think it was. It looked like any of 100 fossil types I had seen in collections, but because of what it represented. That thing had lived. It had been alive on this world before my kind came here, before this world had a name in any language I spoke. It had grown its spiral shell in a warm sea, and it had died in that sea, and the sea had gone away, and the stone had formed, and here it was, still here, still exactly shaped by the life it had lived. I picked it up and put it in my pocket and carried it for 2 years before I lost it somewhere on the move from Marin's Reach to Karath-Ul. I thought about it sometimes. Not about the fossil specifically, about the feeling of it, the weight of an ordinary thing that had been alive a very long time ago and had passed its particular arrangement of atoms forward into the rock and waited there without knowing it was waiting. Sitting on the apron with my tea, with the vault open behind me and the researchers working inside it with careful, reverent hands, I understood that the fossil and the vault were part of the same story. That everything was part of the same story. The story that started with the first carbon and the first star, and passed itself forward through every death and every life and every turning of every world. And that the vault had been built to mark one of the moments where that story doubled back on itself and recognized itself in a living face. My face, my carbon. My particular arrangement of atoms that had been the first arrangement of atoms on some world so far back in time that the world itself no longer existed as anything more than dispersed matter. And yet the carbon remained, and it had made its way through every link of the chain, through every creature and every generation and every crossing of every dark space between stars, and it had ended up in me, in Petra Vane, who had been late to work because her boot weld had come apart in the night. I finished the tea. I stood up. Dr. Kaur came out of the vault and walked toward me with a tablet in her hand and an expression on her face that meant she had found something significant and was trying to decide how to begin explaining it. I waited. She said, "The column contains a record. Not a record of this world or this site. A record of a distribution event, what appears to be a deliberate seeding event." She said the data was dense, and the translation would take years, possibly decades, and that the encoding method was unlike anything in the xenolinguistic literature, but had an internal logic that the team had already begun to map carefully, with the patience that the vault itself seemed to demand. She said the preliminary read suggested the seeding had covered a large number of star systems, and had been carried out over a period of several thousand years, by a civilization that understood biological chemistry at a level that contemporary science had barely begun to approach. I said, "And they built the vaults to recognize when their seeds came home." She looked at me for a moment and then she said, "Yes, that is what it looks like." I nodded. I looked at the open vault, the light still coming from within, patient, and even as it had been from the moment the door parted. I thought about the word seeds, about what it means to plant something in a place and walk away and wait for it to grow into something that would find its own way back, not because you told it to, not because it remembered, but because the nature you gave it would eventually bring it to a door built to receive it. I thought about the 11 years I had spent on this plateau, clearing grit from the base of a sealed vault that no one could open, and about the torn glove, and about the small seismic tremor that had shifted my balance at exactly the right moment, and I thought about the quality of chance that accumulates into something that looks, from a certain angle, like intention. I do not know if I believe in intention at that scale. I am a practical person, but I know what I felt, and what I felt, standing at the entrance to the origination vault on the morning it opened, was that the universe had been keeping track of something. Not of me, specifically. I am not important enough for that, and I do not think that is how it works, but of the thing I carried. The thing all of us carry, every living creature on every world that has ever hosted life, the ancient specific marker of the first ignition, the molecular signature of the oldest carbon, passed forward without loss through every link of the chain since the beginning. It had been keeping track of that. And on that morning, on that plateau, in that particular arrangement of chance and routine and a torn polymer glove, the thing it had been tracking had pressed itself against the stone. And the stone had answered. I have been asked, many times and in many ways, whether my life changed after the event at Karath-Ul. The straightforward answer is yes, in obvious ways. I left the site 6 months later. I spent 2 years in front of various bodies explaining what I experienced. I have given a large number of interviews that I try to approach honestly, and my name is attached permanently to a discovery that will almost certainly be studied for centuries. Those are changes. But they are not what the question is usually asking about. The question is usually asking about something more internal, whether I feel different, whether I carry the event differently than I carry other things. The honest answer is that I feel the same mostly. I am still practical. I still care about the quality of a weld. I still notice the particular way low morning light makes certain veins in stone look like writing, and I still find it beautiful, and I still have days when it is just furniture. What is different is this: I have a much clearer sense of what I am made of, not in a mystical sense, in a plain, material, literal sense. The carbon in my body is old, profoundly old. Some of it is first-generation stellar material, forged in a star that died before this solar system existed, and it has been in living things continuously, for so long that the chain of its inheritance runs back to a beginning that I cannot trace but that the vault recognized without difficulty. I carry that. I have always carried it. It was never a secret. It is a known fact of astrophysics and biology, available in any decent library. What is different now is that something ancient and patient, and very far beyond my understanding, looked at what I carry and called it by its oldest name. Oldest carbon, first flame. Not a title, not an honor, not a claim to power or a mandate for any particular course of action. Just the name of a real thing, the name of what I am at the level of my atoms, spoken by something that was built to know it, in the voice of a civilization so old that everything they left behind has turned to signal and stone. I have sat with those words for a long time. I have turned them over. I have asked myself what they are supposed to make me do differently, what they are supposed to change about how I move through the world. The answer I keep returning to is nothing and everything. Nothing, because the thing they name was already true before the vault said it. I was already the oldest carbon. You are. Everyone reading this or hearing it, every living thing on every world, is the inheritor of the same deep chain. The vault did not grant me something I didn't have. It only said out loud what had always been true, and had never needed to be said because it was so fundamental, so woven into the base of what life is, that saying it had never seemed necessary. Everything, because there is a difference between knowing a thing and being told it by something that has waited 40,000 years specifically to do so. There is a difference between understanding abstractly that you are made of old starlight and standing in the open door of a vault that was built by something that understood life at its deepest level, to recognize and acknowledge and remember exactly that. I am a practical person. I cleared spoil from around the base of a sealed vault for 11 years because the pay was steady and the dust settled the same way every morning. I was late to work on the most important morning of my life because a weld had come apart in the night. These things are also true. They are not in contradiction with the rest. The vault is still open. The researchers are still working inside it. The column has begun to yield data that the early reports describe as the most significant xenobiological and xenoarchaeological discovery in the history of the settled worlds, which I believe, though I also know that this kind of language gets attached to things before anyone fully understands them. I trust the process. I read the published summaries when they come out. I try to understand what I can. But sometimes, at night, I think about the first molecule on the first world where the conditions were right, wherever that world was, however long ago, the first arrangement of carbon and hydrogen and oxygen and nitrogen that managed to make a copy of itself in the warm chemical soup it lived in. I think about how it didn't know what it was doing. It didn't have an intention. It was just matter arranged in a way that happened to work, happened to persist, happened to make more of itself until the copies were everywhere. And I think about how far that particular arrangement has traveled since, how many forms it has taken, how many oceans and skies and bodies, how many eyes that opened on how many mornings on how many worlds across how many thousands of years. And I think about how, through all of it, the oldest carbon passed forward, quietly, without ceremony, just doing the thing that living things do, which is persist. And I think about a sealed vault on a basalt plateau, built by someone who understood all of this so well that they could encode it in stone, who wanted to leave a door open at the origin point for whenever the inheritance came home, not a specific heir, not a chosen one, not a bloodline in the dynastic sense, but the inheritance itself, the molecular fact of the first fire, walking up in whatever body it happened to be in on whatever morning it happened to press its hand against the right stone. And I think they were patient. Whatever built that vault was patient in a way that I can barely conceive. They built it knowing it might not be found for 10,000 years or 50,000. They built it knowing they might not be there when it opened. They built it anyway. I think about that patience and I find it deeply, quietly, irreducibly human, not in the species sense, in the deeper sense, the sense that the thing they were patient about was life itself and what life does, and the faith, if patience on that scale can be called faith, that the fire they started would eventually find its way back to the door they left open for it. It did, on a morning when a digger's glove tore in exactly the right place, on a world at the edge of the settled systems, in the hand of a practical woman who was running 30 minutes late. That is the whole story. I have nothing to add to it, that the vault did not say better in 4 words.